Hello, and welcome to this very special edition of SPE Live. I'm Jennifer Miskimins, AIME President-elect Designate and Department Head of Petroleum Engineering at the Colorado School of Mines. In a few moments, we'll welcome today's keynote speaker for an event that is very near and dear to my heart, AIME's 150th anniversary celebration. It is my pleasure to serve as one of two SPE trustees to the AIME board. The American Institute of Mining, Metallurgical, and Petroleum Engineers was founded in 1871 in Pennsylvania as one of the first engineering societies in the United States. AIME's mission is to support its four member societies, including SPE, the largest of the four, and does so by distributing funds, facilitating interaction with relevant engineering and scientific communities, and honoring the legacy and traditions of AIME, such as some of the awards that were handed out this morning at ATCE. The people that I've had the opportunity to meet, work with, and ultimately call friends through both SPE and AIME have added so much to me both professionally and personally. And I'd encourage all of the students and professionals to get as involved as you possibly can as early in your career as you possibly can with SPE and AIME by default. Now, it is truly my privilege to serve SPE as an AIME Board of Trustees member. It is now my honor to introduce today's keynote speaker, Mr. Daniel Yergin, who is joining us live from Washington, D.C. Mr. Yergin is Vice Chairman of IHS Markit. A Pulitzer-Prize winning author of The Prize and bestseller The Quest, Dan is a well-known authority on energy, international politics, and economics. And I would argue that as a professor, the prize should be a required reading for anybody in going into petroleum engineering. Today, he will share his observations on the energy transition and talk about his latest book, The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Daniel Yergin.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and I'm very pleased to be here at this auspicious occasion, the 150th anniversary of AIME. As near as I can tell, and maybe somebody can correct me, the time AIME was founded, world oil consumption was somewhere between 25 and 30,000 barrels a day. Now it's also, of course, the 65th anniversary of the SPE, which is a great organization which I've had the opportunity to interact with around the world and have enormous respect for what it does and how it brings the industry together. And it's the 65th anniversary, which means that it was founded the year before the first post-World War II oil crisis, which was the 1956 Suez crisis. And I believe oil consumption at that point was 15 million barrels a day. Last year, of course, oil consumption got up to 101 million barrels a day. This year, we at IHS Markit think it'll be about 91 million barrels a day. So I think we can say there's been a lot of growth. Of course, a lot has happened. And what I found and why I really undertook to write the new map is because a lot has happened in the last 10 years. Think of all the changes. First, of course, the one you all know very well, the Shale Revolution. Jennifer, I think if you went back to the textbooks you were educated on, in petroleum engineering probably didn't feature shale as a major resource. So this shows how technology continues to change things. As a result, the U.S. went from being the biggest importer of oil in the world to being the biggest producer. We've also had the solar revolution, where solar costs have come down for panels by as much as 85%. The Paris Climate Agreement, 2 price collapses, and dramatic changes in the world, including the change in the relationship between the United States and China, which is a very evident change from a focus on collaboration to the sense now where the two countries, the terms used are strategic rivals. So I thought about all of this gathering, what it represents in the members, and it seemed to me there were 2 related themes to talk about, which Jennifer has highlighted. One is, in fact, the shale revolution, its consequences, and where the oil and gas industry goes from here. And the other is the energy transition. Everywhere you go in the world, you run into that term. In fact, you collide. It's inescapable. But I thought for this discussion, I would put my cards on the table right at the beginning. I believe, and it's reflected in the new map and the reasons why, the global oil and gas industry will continue to grow for at least the next decade, and then it will more plateau rather than kind of a sharp decline. That, of course, we are in the energy transition is beginning, driven by climate policies. But I would argue, and again, this is controversial, that the energy transition will be more expensive, more complicated, and will take a lot longer. Now, once upon a time, the United States was the world's dominant oil producer. During World War II, out of every 7 barrels of oil that the Allies used, 6 came from the United States. But 1 year after the end of World War II, exactly 1 year, in August 1946, a tanker arrived in Philadelphia Harbor carrying 115,000 barrels of oil that had been produced in the Middle East. This was the first major cargo of Middle East oil that came to the United States. And it was announced it was coming for testing purposes. Well, more oil followed. 2 years later, the first shipment from Saudi Arabia. And within a couple of years, before that decade was over, the US had gone from being a net exporter to being a net importer. And in particular, after 1973, one president after another would talk about energy independence. They talked about it so often that it became a joke for late night comedians. But to me, it seemed at the time the only question was how much more oil was the United States going to import? How much higher would imports rise? The US seemed to be on a permanent decline. And many of you will remember that that was the year, a little more than a decade ago, of peak oil when the world was going to run out. And at that point, 2008, the United States was importing 60% of its oil. It changed. It changed partly because of the stubbornness of one man named George P. Mitchell. Again, some of you will know him, have known him. Many of you will know about him. He thought of himself not as an oil man, but as a gas man. He really believed in natural gas. And once upon a time, when I was teaching at the Harvard Business School, the phone rang in my office. I picked it up. It was George Mitchell. And he had the idea that said something really positive about coal. Actually, I had no idea what he had in mind, but he kind of berated me for 10 or 15 minutes about why natural gas was superior to coal. He was really committed to coal. He also had a problem that he was contracted to provide 10% of Chicago's natural gas, and he feared that he was going to simply couldn't meet it. His reserves wouldn't support it. But he had read an article written in a journal, I think it was actually a draft article by one of his geologists, saying you could get gas out of shale rock. And for it was really 16 years, he pounded away at it. People in the company said, George, you're wasting your time, you're wasting your money. He didn't own all of the company, but he controlled it, and he kept going, even though his board was growing more and more skeptical. So there was one more well that was going to be try it in just north of Dallas, and it hadn't been working. Frustration was growing, and one of the petroleum engineers working on the project, Nick Steinsberger, happened to go, at least he told me the story, to a baseball game in Dallas, happened to sit next to somebody who told him about slick water fracking being used not in shale, but another purpose. They went back and tried it, and of course that was a well that changed world history because the shale drilling did work. But it took another 5 years with horizontal drilling, when Mitchell had become part of Devon, to yoke those two technologies together. And that was really the beginning of the Shale Revolution. Although I remember people just didn't take it seriously. They thought it was a bubble. The US was going to become the largest importer of LNG. But it wasn't a bubble. It turned into a very big, substantial industry. And the United States, in February of this year, just before the pandemic gripped the country, was producing 13 million barrels a day, 2 million barrels a day more than Russia, more than Saudi Arabia. Well, the consequences of this revolution was suggested by that. The US has become the world's largest producer of oil and gas, and that continues today. There are other things, however, that are not so obvious, and that's a pity for kind of the political debates we've had. Because of the use of natural gas replacing coal in electric generation, US CO2 emissions are down to the level of 1990 1990, 30 years ago, although our economy has doubled. We've had more than $200 billion in new factories in the United States because of shale gas. We have several million more jobs. It's been a big stimulus to manufacturing in the Midwest. It's reduced our balance of trade deficit by several $100 billion. It's brought in a lot of government revenues. And I remember what Ben Bernanke said after he stepped down as chairman of the Federal Reserve. He spoke at our CERAWeek conference. He said that actually the shale revolution was one of the most positive, and they said maybe the most positive thing to have happened to the US economy since the financial crisis of 2008. Even less recognized is what it means for foreign policy. I have a story in the book about when I was at a conference in St. Petersburg, and I was given the opportunity to ask Vladimir Putin a question. He was on the stage with Chancellor Merkel. And I was supposed to ask him about diversifying his economy. Somehow I mentioned shale, and he started shouting at me in front of the audience because he really didn't like shale. And I realized that from Russia's point of view, it saw shale gas from the US, LNG as a competitor with Russian gas, and also saw shale as bolstering the influence and the reach of the United States in the world. This morning, we did the first day of our India Energy Forum. We had Prime Minister Modi from India there, and I chaired the session with him. And he talked about how this relationship with the United States now has a very strong energy foundation because they import oil and gas from the United States. And then it also brings energy security in a fundamental way. Last September, 13 months ago, drones, presumably Iranian drones, struck Abqaiq and Khurais. So Abqaiq is the most important infrastructure in the world oil industry, capacity of about 7 million barrels a day of Saudi oil. Their aim was to destroy it. In years past, this would have sent panic in the market. Prices would have shot up. Well, they didn't, partly because the Saudis were able to repair it rather quickly, because they built redundancy to their system. But the other reason is because of shale, because the position of the world oil market is different because of US oil, because it's changed and it's created a whole set of buffers and taken this insecurity out of the market. Well, we know where the Trump administration stands on this. President Trump has talked about energy dominance. He's perhaps the most fervent salesman for US LNG of anybody in the world. But obviously there are questions, and you all have questions about what does Joe Biden think about this? He has a $2 trillion climate plan that everybody ought to look at. During the primaries, banning fracking became a litany among several of the candidates in the Democratic primary. And I often scratch my head and said, well, what does it really mean to ban fracking? And what it would actually be is an import more oil policy is what it would have been, because there's still 280 million cars in the United States, and almost all of them run on gasoline. But Vice President Biden has continued to distance himself from that. You know, he said in the debate the other night he would ban it on federal lands, but do fracking, but he's not going to ban fracking. And I think he not only was vice president, he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I think he recognizes that, in fact, the position of the U.S. in oil and gas is a real asset for U.S. foreign policy. I think the logical thing to expect, and he said it, is more regulation. There's a lot more talk about a carbon tax and so-called border tax on carbon products. Pipelines would be more difficult to build. They'll look at the more emphasis on this abstract science of figuring out the climate impact of specific pipelines. As I said, he said there'll be a ban on federal lands. But federal lands, on the one hand, there are a lot of federal lands in the United States. A lot of people don't know that 47% of the 11 Western states are federal lands. But at least according to my colleagues in IHS Markit, 90% of shale development is on private lands. But, even before the campaign, even before COVID, the shale revolution was in need of a second revolution. And really it was the whole oil and gas industry, because it needed to change needed a new social contract, we can say, with investors. It needed to return money to investors. It was no longer a case of drill at any cost, it was a drill at what cost. And the industry was beginning to reposition itself, and then came COVID-19, and US production has dropped from 13 million barrels a day as the industry went into kind of a crisis mode that it's working its way out. We think at the end of the year, an industry that was at 13 million barrels a day in February will be about 10.5 or 11 million barrels a day by the end of the year. And of course, the reason for that is the collapse in demand, the collapse in prices. But it is important to, again, keep this in perspective. We all know the dramatic events of last April when world oil demand went down by almost 30 million barrels a day out of the 101 million barrel a day market. But currently, our expectation is that demand for the year will end up about 10% down. One of the things we do at IHS Markit is we survey 15,000 gasoline stations a week. And so we're tracking that very closely, and we see that gasoline demand was down 50% in the United States in April. Now it's down about 18% from last year, and it seems to have plateaued. And I think as long as we're in this twilight zone of COVID-19, we'll probably remain in a plateau. And until we're out of this, until the vaccine is widely accepted, I think we'll be looking at oil prices probably in the range of the high 30s to the high 40s. After the vaccine, things will change. What happens then? Our economists at IHS Markit think GDP is down about 4.5% this year. Next year, we're looking at about a 4.4% recovery. So it means probably in 2022 is when we regain and perhaps exceed the GDP level of 2019. And it's around that time, I think, that we would see world oil demand get back to where we were. I am struck that my colleagues in China at IHS Markit say that China is already consuming more oil now than it did last year at this time. And this morning in our conference with Prime Minister Modi in India and Minister Pradhan, it was said that oil demand in India is actually back to the level of last year. So demand will come back, and demand will be critical. How will it be changed? Well, in a sense, this conference tells us something about it. Well, we'll have more remote conferences. There'll be less business travel, probably. The big question I think companies will struggle with is remote work, digitalization. What happens to communities, commuting? How will people work? And you hear in companies saying, well, some things work well. Obviously, essential employees are on the line anyway. But what about culture, creativity? What about bringing on new people to your company in terms of onboarding people? People do need to be together. And I think they will come together when it feels safe to do it. Now, there is a big debate in the industry and worldwide about peak demand, not peak supply, peak demand. And it's really a great subject of debate. And there's some who say that, we've reached it already. I think we have to be careful about generalizing from where we are in this crisis. We might see quite a strong rebound afterwards. I was struck again this morning at our conference. India's oil demand today is about 4.5 million barrels a day. In 20 to 25 years, it's expected to double or more than double. Demand, you can't just look at the developed nations, you've got to look at the emerging markets. So there will be a balance between Zoom transport and real transport, but we'll see recovery. But that still gets us to this question of climate and climate policies and what's ahead in terms of an energy transition. And I am very struck again by the fact that there's more than one meaning of energy transitions, and it's very fresh in my mind. And in the new map, I actually have a chapter about India and energy transition, and it was reiterated this morning by Indian Prime Minister and the Indian Petroleum Minister. energy transition has multiple meanings. For an emerging market, a country like India, it's not only about wind and solar, it's also about moving away from traditional energy to commercial energy. What does that mean? There are about 7.8 billion people in the world today. About 3 billion of them, roughly around 40% or so, actually cook with waste wood, animal waste, crop waste. The World Health Organization, which of course we all know now because of COVID-19, the World Health Organization before this said that the world's #1 environmental problem was indoor air pollution from cooking with traditional fuels. And a country like India, a energy transition means a transition away from those traditional fuels to commercial energy. And thus, we were just talking this morning in India that they're building a $60 billion gas infrastructure in the country, spending tens and tens of billions of dollars more to build up their consumption of oil, cleaner oil, but of oil, building new refineries. Very different picture in a country that is still emerging, that still has low income, and is going to continue to go up in income. I think, again, it struck me this morning, this issue of energy transition has gotten even more complicated because of the new focus on supply lines, supply chains, and geopolitics. And that gets to the US-China relationship. The biggest research project I'm involved in right now at IHS Markit is on what we call the new supply chains for net zero carbon economy. Because people assume the wind is free, sun is free, but all the materials that go into building that equipment and so forth, it has to come from somewhere, and it has to move from one place to another. And so, you all know that term, big oil. People can't resist using that in their headline. Well, I think we're going to move into an area of big shovels, a lot of mining, and there's going to be questions about those supply chains too. And the scale of it, I think, will be a constraint. So I think you need to think about an energy transition as it's discussed in North America and Western Europe, but an energy transition for much of the world has a very different meaning. The other thing is we use the term energy transition, but it's really energy evolutions. And I argue in the new map that it's actually been going on since a specific month in 1709, in January, when a metal worker discovered that, named Abraham Darby the first, discovered that he could use coal instead of wood to make iron, and he would get a better quality iron. And yet it took a long time. That was the beginning. It wasn't until 1900 that coal accounted for half the world's energy. So during the 19th century, which people think of as the century of coal, it wasn't the dominant energy. Oil, Colonel Drake, 1859, Titusville. It wasn't until the 1960s that oil became the #1 energy source. So things take time. But you could say this time is different because it's not just driven by economics, it's not just driven by technology, but it's driven by concerns about climate that are driven by government policies. California is saying it's going to ban internal combustion engines by after 2035, by government incentives and investments, and by a growing pressure from investors who are pursuing what's called ESG, environmental social governance, in asking companies, how do you account for your strategies in terms of Paris? What is Paris? Paris is a 2015 climate conference that 195 nations signed on to restrict the growth in temperatures. And as I thought about it when I was writing the new map, it seemed to me that energy is now divided from that point of view into terms of 2 eras. One era is before Paris, and another is after Paris. So we are seeing these climate goals of Paris being embedded in government policies, in company strategies and announcements, and in the perspective of investors. And so that pressure is there. But again, I would say that when you look at the scale of what's involved, and I think the scale kind of gets ignored, it will be more expensive, it will take longer, more complicated, and it will have unexpected consequences. And one of which I'll point to is the work that we're now doing on supply chains to actually make all of this happen. A few aspects: wind and solar, utilities are moving. I spoke to the Edison Electric Institute, which is the CEO organization, the CEOs of that group in September. And clearly, US utilities are moving towards some kind of net zero carbon, towards more wind and solar. They're going there for economics, they're going there because they're pressed by investors, they're pressed by the regulators to do that. And the costs are coming down, and wind costs have come down a lot. Solar has come down a great deal based upon Chinese manufacturing. 70% of the solar panels come from China, another 10% from Chinese companies elsewhere. India, after, there's been shooting in the Himalayas between India and China, and the Indians want to kind of separate themselves from Chinese supply chains. So Indian companies wanted to not buy panels from China, and they went to other companies and found that they were Chinese companies too. So there's this whole geopolitical complication. And I often find that people talk about wind and solar, assuming it's going to replace oil. Well, wind and solar will compete with natural gas, and we're seeing that competition. They're partners, but they're also competitors. The wind and solar don't power the kind of cars we have around the world today. So that gets you to electric vehicles. And I have a marvelous story in the new map about where the electric vehicles come from. I spent time talking with J.B. Straubel, who was the technical director, chief technical officer as he became of Tesla. And he had a lunch in Los Angeles at a fish restaurant with a man named Elon Musk, where he was trying to persuade him to invest in an electric airplane. And Musk said, I have no interest in that. But then he said, well, what about electric car? And Musk said, I'd be interested in that. And indeed, that was the beginning of Tesla. And it was quite audacious to have start an electric car company in the United States. There hadn't been a new car company in the United States since 1925. But it's a remarkable story because today, I was just looking at it, the market capitalization of Tesla, which sold 362,000 cars in 2019, is greater than the combined market capitalization of GM, Ford, Toyota, Volkswagen, and those companies produce 42 million cars last year. But automakers are moving towards EVs. There's great regulatory pressure on them to do that, especially in Europe. There'll be very large financial pressures if they don't move in that direction. But if we banned all the cars in the U.S., it would reduce world CO2 emissions by maybe 1 or 2% at the most. So when we do our scenarios, our planning scenario for IHS Markit, let me just give you some numbers. There are 1.4 billion cars in the world today. We're saying there'll be about 1.9 billion by 2050. We think by that time, about a third of them will be electric. That means 2/3 will still be powered by gasoline. But we also think that 60 to 80% of the new cars being sold will be electric cars. But also, sometimes you need perspective. Automobiles reflect about 20% of world oil demand. It's not a higher number than that. But what's being talked about in terms of the energy transition is rebuilding the energy foundations of modern economy. That is a really big job. The scale is enormous. Europe has these goals to do it. They don't know how they're going to do it, and even economists who are working on it, who are very supportive, say they have no idea what the cost will be. There's also the question of technology. Did a study last year in partnership with Ernie Moniz, the former US Energy Secretary. We did it for did it for Bill Gates Foundation and for what's called the Energy Breakthrough Coalition, and basically looked at the technologies that aren't there that are needed in order to meet the kind of climate goals that are out there. And by the way, one of the technologies that's needed is carbon capture, very important part of the picture. Technologies take time. Wind and solar, those are both industries that are 50 years old. It's interesting to note that the modern solar industry, one of the two founding companies happened to be Exxon. It's also, I find, very interesting that the lithium-ion battery was basically initially invented in an Exxon laboratory in 1976, when the general view at that time was that the world was going to run out of oil because of oil crises. It took 40 years for those technologies to get from where they were to really get to scale and go down the cost curve. And so there's a real time factor here, as well as necessary investment in new technologies. So what I think, and that's the conclusion I come to, and I say in the new map, some people won't want to hear that, is we're going to have a mixed system. We already have not an energy transition, we have an energy addition where renewables are being put on top of traditional energies, conventional energies that are growing. Also, I think there's a lack of understanding of the role of oil and gas in our economies. Petroleum products, otherwise known as plastics, have been really critical to the health crisis that we're in now, to keeping food safe and clean, to medicines. People are shocked when they realize that some of their favorite medicines are basically oil products or gas products. The N95 masks that people are wearing, a hospital operating room so dominated by plastics. Remember, I talked to a cardiologist. He said, I couldn't operate without plastics. The tools that will put a stent into the heart of somebody who needs his heart fixed are made out of plastic. And I quote in the new map a book, an article from the American Journal of Public Health that says plastics are central to the antiseptic model of modern healthcare. That was written in 2010. It is so much more true today as we deal with this pandemic. So let me just take you back to the presidential debate. If some of you, I know many of you watched it, a pretty high viewership. Not taking sides here, if you remember the exchange between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and Biden talked about putting plexiglass in restaurants and I guess in stores too, to separate people to basically prevent transmission of the virus. Well, I think most all of you know that plexiglass is a petroleum-based thermoplastic. And I think, so that just kind of tells you that this is far more engaged in dealing with this crisis, and I think changes some of the attitudes towards plastic. And certainly electric cars have a lot of plastic in them. So just keep that in mind as we listen to the debates and the lack of context and framework for understanding them. And I hope what I've done with this book is provide a framework for understanding that. So to summarize, number one, the US will remain one of the big three of world oil. That was demonstrated, 3 decades people talk about OPEC versus non-OPEC. It was really the big three, and it was demonstrated when it was the United States last April that brokered the deal between Saudi Arabia and Russia that ended the oil price war that had caused prices to really crash going into April of 2020. The U.S. is one of the big three will be one of the big three of LNG, although I think it may end up being the big four because I think Russia's going to be a very big player as well. Secondly, oil demand will continue to rise until around 2030 or the early 2030s, and then there will be a plateau and a kind of decline as countries around the world reach a certain level of income and population growth stabilize. And third major point is an energy transition is a beginning, but it'll take a long time. And for a long time, we will have a mixed energy system with oil and gas continuing to play a very significant role. So the message I'd like to end in, to the very youngest person who's watching this event today, brought to you by the SPE, the very youngest person, I want to assure you, at least I have great confidence that oil and gas will continue to be a major business long after you reach your retirement date. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. That was every bit as fascinating and informative as I knew it would be. So appreciate you doing this with us today. So Dan has graciously agreed to open to some Q&A. And if you have questions, please ask in the LinkedIn comments or the YouTube chat box, and we'll try and get to as many as we possibly can. So as the moderator, you get the ask usually the first question, and I think you've probably answered it a little bit here with some of your final comments. But as a professor, I get asked a lot about whether somebody should go into petroleum engineering or look at other opportunities. What would you say to that 17, 18-year-old that's thinking about a career and whether they should go into petroleum engineering or not?
Well, I would continue to say that this industry is going to have quite a long life, and it's going to need a lot of petroleum engineers, and so there'll be opportunities. Obviously, it's an industry that goes through cycles, and the cycles are cause pain when they come. I think the one we're in now is unprecedented, and it's not really supply and demand that did it, but rather it's really the consequence of the virus. So, what I would say is that there's quite a long career ahead of you if you go into engineering. The need will be there. This business is, for the next 10 years, it's going up, not down. And even after that, just replacing reserves is a very big business.
Thank you. Thank you. So,
what do you say to? I should ask. What do you say to your students?
Well, they might listen to you more than they listen to me sometimes. So.
Okay.
So there's a question that came up. What is needed to communicate the message about important gas and oil to avoid the us versus them kind of narrative? What's your 30-second elevator speech to somebody that you might be trying to communicate some of this to?
Well, I think it's how pervasive and fundamental it is to the whole society. I think, secondly, what has been done to address the pollution questions and will continue to be done to do that. I am, and I think the other thing is those points that I made that are not well recognized about the impact of the Shale Revolution, the economic significance of it. This is a really important industry. The overall oil and gas industry in the United States, before this happened, before the COVID, was over 12 million people. So I think it is kind of talking, sometimes the industry talks for itself. So I think really communicating scale, its importance. And then I think the other thing that's not understood, you understand it, your students understand it, people in the industry understand it. This, in many ways, is a high-tech industry. And the fact, people, have images in their mind. I ask people, why do you want to ban fracking? They can't actually articulate it. Or they read scare stories or seen scare stories. So I think that communication thing becomes even more critical. And I think that with COVID-19, the role of this industry, both the reliability, keeping the supplies going, despite everybody having to work in very different ways, and also the role of its products in keeping people healthy and safe and alive, is something that it's not out there. I just have really wondered during this COVID crisis why this isn't more clearly.
Thank you. So question came in, what about geothermal, the future or the role that geothermal might play in some of the energy transition?
I think that, I remember earlier years excitement about geothermal, California, Indonesia. I don't have the sense that geothermal, it is a technology and capability that will help some companies, but I don't have the sense that it's a big player.
Would you or could you give a rough idea of how much of an electrical vehicle actually comes from petrochemicals?
I can't. I wish I could. Somebody's got to figure that out. That's a really good question, and I think an important question that's there. It ties into the other question that is much on my mind, which is the supply chains for making electrical vehicles, or for making solar panels, or for making wind turbines, and the fact that kind of supply chain seems to be sort of over there, and they were about economics, about technology efficiency, and over here was geopolitics. But I mean, the two of them are now beginning to collide. But I think that's a really good question, and somebody should, somebody should look into that.
Okay. So there's been some pretty major discoveries in deep water recently, and some definite pickup of production there. Do you see deep water as being able to survive with some of the capital costs that are associated with that?
Yes, I think so. I think costs there have come down. And obviously, one of the, we've had, in a sense, 7 years of digitalization compressed into 7 months. And I think what we hear from lots of companies is using more digitalization to manage offshore facilities and so forth. And everything is focused on bringing costs down. So, I think offshore very definitely will remain part of the mix.
Okay. So I think we're going to go with one more for you since we have you here. What do you see as the dominant fill-in energy source as petroleum output declines?
Well, I think it is basically a shift from molecules to electrons. It will be increasing electrification is where things are headed, and it is interesting to see. The automobile makers are all trying to get on the electric vehicle bandwagon now. Some because they're convinced, and some because they're feeling just the pressure that they're an industry that really depends on what governments want. The other side of it is what do consumers want, and and one of the things that I think about is that we're going to come out of this COVID crisis with governments having taken on a staggering amount of debt. And I think there'll be some contention between, let's say, finance ministers and call them ecology or environmental ministers as to where you put your dollars. How much of it is about really, let's say, rescuing the small businesses that have their backs against the wall or have already gone out of business, and how much do you do in promoting energy transition? I think governments will be struggling with that, but I think the general trend. Now, the other question, though, which I think is implied in that, and I don't know if you're getting at that, is the hydrogen question. Some of us can remember 15 years ago when Governor Schwarzenegger was building the hydrogen highway in California, but it ended up being a highway that went nowhere. And I think even 4 years ago, if you talked about hydrogen as a major energy source or player, people would have said, what are you talking about? I'm very struck, I would say, in the last 18 months, how the intense interest. I mean, the Indian government today, they just announced their hydrogen plan. Europe has a hydrogen thing. We created a hydrogen forum, and when we created it 4 years ago, people didn't take it very seriously, but it's really everywhere you go now, because I think there is the sense that you need something of scale if you're going to start to push natural gas aside, you have to replace it with something. And hydrogen is now much, just kind of everybody's at least looking at it, or not everybody, but most people seem to be looking at it very carefully. Then the question is how you produce the hydrogen. Is it blue hydrogen or is it green hydrogen? But we're going to hear a lot more about hydrogen in the next couple of years. I want to emphasize the other thing that really needs attention is carbon capture. And because when you look at the reality of what energy supply is actually going to be, as opposed to what people some people kind of aspirations, you see that oil and gas have a much longer timeline, but there will be pressure for carbon capture.
Well, thank you, Dan. Very much appreciate your time and insights today. And this was a very special way for us to celebrate AIME's 150th and to wrap up Member Monday at the SPE's annual conference. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, let me thank you and AIME and SPE. Started the discussion really with SPE a long time ago. We didn't know how the conference was going to shape up. So I'm really delighted that it has occurred and taken place in way in the adaptation. And I very much appreciated the dialogue with SPE. Forward to this event and the ongoing dialogue that we and my colleagues have with SPE. And a lot of my colleagues are members of SPE, so it's a special pleasure to be here on both the 150th anniversary and the 65th anniversary. So, Jennifer, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to the audience for participating today. I have a few announcements that go along with ATCE. So just a reminder that ATCE's technical program and the exhibitor zone begins tomorrow. This year's virtual ATCE has added benefits, including live and on-demand access from anywhere in the world, discipline-specific chat rooms, and easy-to-connect networking options, and exhibitor presentations. For a full list of the technical program, we've included a link in the description and the chat of this broadcast. We've also added the registration link for anyone still interested in attending our virtual ATCE event. Thanks again to Mr. Daniel Yergin for joining us today. We'll have this video available on demand for your access or to share with anyone else via the LinkedIn or YouTube link. Congratulations to AIME, happy 150th anniversary, and thank you for joining us today.